The sun hung low over the dusty horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold as Nathan Wilder rode into the small settlement of Fargo, Dakota Territory, 1878. Blood seeped from a wound in his shoulder, but the pain barely registered compared to the weight of the promise he'd made to a dying man 3 days prior. The town's main street stretched before him like the last line of defense between civilization and wilderness, populated by wooden storefronts that had weathered years of harsh prairie winters and relentless summer heat. Nathan's mare trotted wearily toward the hitching post outside the town's only saloon. A weathered sign reading "Silver Dollar" swung lazily in the evening breeze. The journey from Fort Abraham Lincoln had taken longer than expected, delayed by a Sioux hunting party that had taken interest in his path. He'd managed to avoid confrontation, but the detour had cost him precious time he wasn't sure the Campbell family had left. Inside the saloon, conversations died as Nathan pushed through the batwing doors. His tall frame, dusty trail clothes, and the unmistakable bulge of a Colt revolver on his hip marked him as a man familiar with the frontier's dangers. His dark hair fell in unkempt waves beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and several days' worth of stubble covered his jaw. At 28, Nathan had the weathered look of someone who had seen far more than his years suggested. "Whiskey?" he rasped to the barkeeper, sliding a coin across the scarred wooden surface. "And information." The barkeeper, a balding man with arms like tree trunks, poured the amber liquid without comment. "Information costs more than whiskey in these parts, stranger." Nathan drained the glass in one swallow, feeling the burn down his throat. "I'm looking for the Campbell place, Grace Campbell and her brother." The saloon fell silent, as if he'd mentioned the devil himself. The barkeeper's expression hardened. "What business you got with the Campbells?" "Their father sent me." Nathan placed another coin on the bar, "before Rawlins and his boys killed him." A chair scraped against the wooden floor as a bearded man stood up from a nearby table. "You're either mighty brave or mighty foolish to speak that name in this town, mister." Nathan turned slowly. "Neither, just a man keeping a promise." "Campbell's been dead 3 weeks," the bearded man continued. "His daughter's still holding onto that worthless piece of land. Rawlins will have it soon enough." "Not if I have anything to say about it," Nathan replied, his voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at his muscles. "Where can I find her?" a woman's voice answered from the doorway. "You can find me right here." All heads turned to see Grace Campbell standing in the entrance, her honey-colored hair pulled back in a practical braid, dust from the road clinging to her simple dress. Despite the weariness evident in her posture, her green eyes blazed with a determination that caught Nathan off guard. At 24, she carried herself with the dignity of someone twice her age, shoulders squared against the weight of recent tragedy. "Miss Campbell," Nathan acknowledged with a slight nod. "I'm Nathan Wilder. Your father not here," she interrupted, casting a wary glance around the room. "These walls have ears that report back to Rawlins." Nathan nodded, leaving his empty glass on the bar and following Grace outside. The street had grown darker, the last rays of sunlight fading from the western horizon. Grace moved with purpose toward a wagon parked at the edge of town, a young man of perhaps 19 sitting at the reins. The family resemblance was unmistakable, the same determined set to his jaw, though his hair was several shades darker than his sister's. "This is my brother Thomas," Grace introduced briefly. "Thomas, this is apparently the help father sent for." The young man gave Nathan a skeptical once-over. "You're alone?" "I am," Nathan confirmed, untying his horse from the hitching post. "Father promised men." "Plural," Thomas said accusingly. "What good is one gun against Rawlins and his gang?" "Thomas," Grace admonished quietly. Nathan met the young man's gaze steadily. "Your father found me in Bismarck. He'd been looking for men willing to stand against Rawlins. We were supposed to meet with others, but Rawlins' men caught up to us first." His jaw tightened at the memory. "Your father took 2 bullets meant for me. His last words were for me to find you to help protect what's yours." Grace's composed expression faltered momentarily. "Did he?" Did he suffer? Nathan had never been good at comforting words, but he knew better than to offer false ones. It was quick. He spoke of you both until the end. Thomas looked away, blinking rapidly. Grace placed a steadying hand on her brother's arm before turning back to Nathan. We're grateful you've come, Mr. Wilder, but Thomas is right. One man against Rawlins won't be enough. He has at least 6 men working for him, all killers. I've faced worse odds, Nathan replied, though in truth he had rarely faced such a stacked deck. Your father saved my life. I aim to repay that debt. Grace studied him for a long moment, as if measuring his worth with just her gaze. Then you'd better come with us. It's nearly 5 miles to our ranch, and I'd prefer to make it before full dark. Nathan mounted his mare, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. He'd need to tend to it properly once they reached the Campbell place, but for now it would hold. As they left Fargo behind, the vast Dakota prairie spread out before them, bathed in the soft blue light of dusk. Nathan kept his hand near his revolver, eyes scanning the horizon. He'd made a promise to John Campbell, and he intended to keep it, even if it meant standing alone against impossible odds. The Campbell ranch came into view just as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. It was a modest spread, a solidly built main house, a barn, and a few outbuildings, all surrounded by open grazing land that stretched toward distant hills. A creek cut through the property, its water reflecting the moonlight. It's not much, Grace said as they approached, but it's been in our family for 15 years. Father built it with his own hands after the war. It's good land, Nathan observed, noting the healthy cattle grazing in a nearby pasture. Good enough that Rawlins wants it, Thomas added bitterly. His railroad needs to cut through our property to reach the mines up north. When Father refused to sell, Rawlins decided to take matters into his own hands. They pulled up outside the main house, and Nathan dismounted, leading his mare toward the small stable attached to the barn. Grace followed, carrying a lantern to light their way. Thomas will see to your horse, she offered. You look like you could use tending yourself. Nathan didn't argue. Now that they had reached safety, relative safety, at least the adrenaline that had kept him going was fading, and the pain in his shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. The interior of the Campbell home was modest but comfortable, with handcrafted furniture and faded calico curtains framing the windows. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, casting warm light across the wooden floorboards. Sit, Grace instructed, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. Let me see that wound. Nathan removed his coat and shirt, revealing a deep graze where a bullet had torn through the flesh of his upper arm. The wound had partially reopened during the ride, seeping blood into the makeshift bandage he'd applied. Grace returned with a basin of water, clean cloths, and a bottle of whiskey. This will hurt, she warned, pouring a generous amount of alcohol directly onto the wound. Nathan hissed through clenched teeth but made no other sound as she cleaned the injury with practiced efficiency. You've done this before, he observed as she began stitching the wound closed with neat, even sutures. Our nearest doctor is in Fargo, and he's usually too drunk to be of use, Grace replied, her focus on her work. Out here, you learn to tend your own. When she finished, she wrapped clean bandages around his shoulder and arm. It should heal clean if you keep it dry and don't tear my stitches. Thank you. Nathan pulled his shirt back on, watching as she washed blood from her hands. In the firelight, he could see the toll that recent events had taken on her, the shadows beneath her eyes, the tightness around her mouth. Yet there was a resilience about her that impressed him. How long has Rawlins been after your land? 6 months, give or take, Grace answered, setting the basin aside. At first it was just offers, insultingly low ones. When Father refused, the accident started, fences cut, cattle scattered, then threats. Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. 3 weeks ago, Father rode to Bismarck to file a complaint with the territorial authorities. We never expected him to find help there. John saved my life in a saloon brawl that wasn't my fight, Nathan explained. I was, in a dark place, hadn't cared much whether I lived or died for some time. Your father reminded me there are still things worth fighting for. The door opened as Thomas returned from tending the horses. He carried Nathan's saddlebags and rifle, setting them carefully against the wall. "Your mare's settled. She's a fine animal. Thank you." Nathan acknowledged the compliment with a nod. "She's carried me through worse than this." "If you don't mind my asking," Grace said, pouring 3 cups of coffee from the pot keeping warm at the fire's edge, "what exactly is your plan, Mr. Wilder?" "Rawlins has been telling everyone in town that he'll have our land by the end of the month, one way or another." Nathan accepted the coffee, savoring the bitter warmth. "First, I need to understand what we're facing. How many men does Rawlins have? What kind of weapons? How often do they come around?" "He's got 6 men working for him," Thomas answered promptly. "Mean bastards, all of them. They ride out here every few days, shoot at our livestock, threaten to burn us out." "Thomas," Grace chided at his language, though without much conviction. "It's true, Grace," the young man insisted. "They killed Pa, and they won't stop until they've taken everything." "Is there anyone in town willing to help?" Nathan asked. "The law," Grace gave a bitter laugh. "Sheriff Wilson collects his pay from Rawlins' pocket. As for the townsfolk, they're either afraid or don't care. We're just the stubborn Campbells standing in the way of progress as far as they're concerned." Nathan nodded, having expected as much. "Then we make do with what we have. Tomorrow I'll survey the property, set up some defenses. When Rawlins' men come again, they'll find it's not as easy to intimidate us as they thought." "Us," Grace repeated softly. "You're really staying then?" "I gave my word," Nathan said simply. Later that night, after Grace and Thomas had retired to their rooms, Nathan sat on the porch, cleaning his colt by moonlight. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and the vast expanse of stars overhead reminded him how small human concerns were in the grand scheme of things. Yet to the Campbells, this land meant everything: home, livelihood, future. He'd spent 3 years drifting after the war, taking whatever work came his way, some legal, some not. He'd been a scout for the army, a bounty hunter, even rode shotgun for Wells Fargo for a time. But nowhere had felt like somewhere worth staying, until now, perhaps. Not because of the land itself, but because of the promise he'd made to a dying man, because of the determination in Grace Campbell's eyes when she spoke of her home. Because some fights were worth taking on, even against impossible odds. The wound in his shoulder ached, a reminder of his own mortality. 1 man against 6 was poor arithmetic by any calculation. But Nathan Wilder had never been one to walk away from a fight that needed fighting, and he wasn't about to start now. Morning arrived with the distant rumble of thunder and the promise of rain. Nathan woke before dawn, years of habit bringing him to full alertness in an instant. The house was quiet as he pulled on his boots and slipped outside to check the perimeter. The ranch was more vulnerable than he'd liked: too many approaches without cover, buildings too spread out to defend easily. He'd need to be creative if they were to have any chance against Rawlins' men. By the time Grace emerged from the house, Nathan had already repaired a section of broken fence and was splitting firewood with mechanical efficiency, his injured arm barely hampering his movements. "You should be resting that shoulder," she called as she approached, carrying a tin cup of coffee. "It'll heal," he replied, embedding the axe in the chopping block and accepting the offered cup. "Your property needs work if we're going to defend it properly." Grace's expression sobered. "You really think it will come to that? Men like Rawlins don't back down easily," Nathan said. "Especially when they think they're close to getting what they want." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the distant horizon where dark clouds were gathering. "I keep telling Thomas we should just sell, start fresh somewhere else, but he's so much like father, stubborn to the bone. And you're not." Nathan asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. A small smile touched her lips. "I suppose I have my moments." She hesitated before continuing. "I've put breakfast on. You should eat before the rain comes." Inside, Thomas was already at the table, studying a worn map of the territory. He glanced up as they entered. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about defenses." Nathan pulled up a chair. "Let's hear it." As they ate, Thomas outlined several ideas for fortifying the ranch, some practical, others less so. Nathan listened patiently, recognizing the young man's need to contribute, to feel that he was protecting his home and sister. "Those are good thoughts," Nathan said when Thomas finished, "but our best advantage isn't in fortifications. It's in making them think twice about attacking at all." "How do we do that?" Grace asked, clearing away the breakfast dishes. "We show strength," Nathan explained. "Make them believe we have more resources than we do, and we take the fight to them when they least expect it." Thomas leaned forward eagerly. "I'm a good shot. Pa taught me." Nathan studied the young man thoughtfully. He had the enthusiasm of youth, but lacked the hardness that killing put in a man's eyes. "I hope it doesn't come to shooting, but if it does, I'll need you steady." "What about me?" Grace asked, returning to the table. "I can shoot as well as Thomas." "I don't doubt it," Nathan replied. "But I need you both to understand something. If Rawlins and his men come in force, this won't be like hunting game. Men who kill for money don't go down easy, and they don't fight fair." "We understand," Grace said firmly. "This is our home, Mr. Wilder. We'll defend it however we must." The rain began shortly after breakfast, a steady downpour that turned the yard to mud and confined them to the house. Nathan used the time to inventory their weapons and ammunition: Thomas's hunting rifle, an old Army Springfield that had belonged to their father, Grace's small caliber pistol, and Nathan's own Colt and Winchester repeating rifle. It wasn't much against 6 armed men, but it would have to do. "Tell me about Rawlins," Nathan said as they sat near the fire, the rain drumming on the roof above. "What kind of man is he?" "Clement Rawlins came to Dakota Territory 5 years ago," Grace explained, her fingers busy with mending. "He had money from somewhere back east and big plans for the railroad. He's not the kind of man who gets his hands dirty. He has others do that for him. But he's smart, calculating, and ruthless," Thomas added darkly. "They say he had a partner once who disappeared after a disagreement." "The man's body turned up in the river a week later." "Who are his men?" Nathan pressed. "Any of them have reputations. The worst is a man called Jenkins," Grace said. "He's Rawlins' foreman, though that's just a title. What he really does is enforce Rawlins' will. He's the one who—" She faltered. "He's the one who brought us word of Father's death," seemed almost pleased about it. Nathan's jaw tightened. "Anyone else I should know about?" "There's a Mexican they call Vega," Thomas continued. "He's handy with a knife. The others are just hired guns: Parker, Simmons, Walsh, and a big fellow named Burt. None too bright, but they follow orders." The information painted a clearer picture of what they were facing. Rawlins himself might be the type to avoid direct confrontation, but his men were dangerous enough. 6 against 3, and only one of them, Nathan, with any real experience in this kind of fight. "When did they last come around?" Nathan asked. 5 days ago," Grace answered. "They usually come every week or so. Jenkins said they'd be back to finish our discussion," his words. Which meant they could show up anytime. Nathan needed to prepare, and quickly. The rain continued through the afternoon, finally tapering off as evening approached. Nathan took advantage of the break in the weather to check on the livestock and survey the property more thoroughly. The Campbells had about 50 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and enough grazing land to support twice that number. It was indeed good land, with the creek providing a reliable water source even in dry years. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the muddy ground, Nathan noticed dust on the horizon: riders approaching from the direction of Fargo. "Grace, Thomas," he called, returning quickly to the house. "We have company." Grace appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her expression tightened as she spotted the approaching riders. "Rawlins' men, sooner than I expected." "How many?" Thomas asked, emerging behind his sister with his rifle in hand. 5 by my count," Nathan replied. "Get inside, both of you. Let me handle this." "This is our fight too," Grace protested. "And we'll fight it," Nathan assured her. "But not today. Today I just want to size them up, see what we're dealing with." Reluctantly, the siblings withdrew into the house. Though Nathan noticed they positioned themselves near windows where they could observe and provide covering fire if needed, Nathan stood on the porch, thumbs hooked casually in his belt as the riders approached. He counted 5 men, just as he'd thought. The one in the lead was tall and lean, with a cruel set to his mouth and eyes that had seen too much violence. Jenkins, most likely. Behind him rode a smaller man with dark hair and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, Vega, perhaps. The others matched the descriptions Thomas had provided. "That's far enough," Nathan called when they were about 30 yards from the house. The riders slowed, then stopped, clearly surprised to find a stranger guarding the Campbell property. "Who the hell are you?" Jenkins demanded, his hand resting near his holstered pistol. "Name's Wilder," Nathan replied evenly. "I'm watching over the Campbell place for a spell." Jenkins exchanged glances with his companions. "This don't concern you, Wilder. We got business with the Campbells." "Any business you have with them, you can discuss with me," Nathan said, his stance relaxed but alert. "And from what I hear, your business has concluded. They're not selling." The scarred man, Vega, spat on the ground. "Another fool willing to die for nothing." "The Campbell's land belongs to Mr. Rawlins now. It's just a matter of time." "Time's something I've got plenty of," Nathan responded, his voice taking on an edge. "What I don't have is patience for men who threaten women and boys. So why don't you ride on back to town and tell Rawlins if he wants to talk business, he can come himself?" Like a man, Jenkins' face darkened with anger. "You've got a big mouth for someone outnumbered 5-1. Numbers don't mean much to a dead man," Nathan said coldly. "And the first one of you to draw will be exactly that." A tense silence fell over the yard. Nathan could see the calculations running behind Jenkins' eyes, the risk versus the reward, the uncertainty of facing an unknown opponent. Finally, the foreman sneered. "We'll be back, Wilder. With Mr. Rawlins and all our friends. Enjoy your time with the Campbells while it lasts." "Looking forward to it," Nathan replied with a dangerous smile. Jenkins wheeled his horse around, and the others followed suit. Nathan watched until they disappeared over the rise, then let out a slow breath. The confrontation had gone as well as could be expected, but he had no illusions about what would come next. Jenkins would report to Rawlins, and they would return in force, likely all 6 of them, possibly more. Grace and Thomas emerged from the house as soon as the riders were gone. "That was either very brave or very foolish," Grace observed, though there was admiration in her voice. "Sometimes there's not much difference," Nathan admitted, "but now we know what we're dealing with. And more importantly, they're uncertain about what they're facing. Doubt is a powerful weapon." "What happens now?" Thomas asked. "Now," Nathan said grimly, "we prepare for war." The next 2 days passed in a flurry of activity. Nathan set about fortifying the ranch as best he could with limited resources. They reinforced the doors and windows of the main house, dug firing positions that offered clear lines of sight to all approaches, and moved the livestock to the pasture farthest from the main road. Thomas proved to be a quick learner and a willing worker, taking to Nathan's instructions with the seriousness of someone who understood the stakes. Grace, too, contributed more than her share, never complaining even as they worked from dawn until well after dusk. On the evening of the second day, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Grace brought out a pot of coffee and 3 cups. "You think they'll really come in force?" she asked, settling on the bench beside Nathan. "I'd count on it," he replied honestly. "Men like Rawlins can't afford to look weak. My challenging him publicly means he has to respond, and respond decisively." Thomas, leaning against the porch railing, frowned. "Maybe we should have just shot Jenkins and his men when we had the chance." "And make ourselves murderers in the eyes of the law," Grace shook her head. "No, Thomas, that's not who we are." "Your sister's right," Nathan added. "We defend what's ours, but we don't become like them to do it." They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping coffee and watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. It was a peaceful moment, all the more precious for its fragility. "You never told us much about yourself, Mr. Wilder," Grace said eventually. "What brought you to Dakota Territory?" Nathan gazed into his coffee cup as if the answers might be found in its depths. "After the war, I didn't have much to go back to in Virginia. My family's farm was gone, most of my friends dead or scattered, so I drifted west like a lot of men," he shrugged. Picked up skills along the way, found I was good at some things I'm not particularly proud of. Like fighting, Thomas asked. Like surviving, Nathan corrected. There's a difference. Grace studied him thoughtfully. And is that all you want from life, just to survive? The question caught Nathan off guard. It had been a long time since anyone had asked him about wants beyond the immediate needs of food, shelter, and safety. A long time since he'd allowed himself to consider such things. I reckon a man needs more than that, he admitted slowly. But I haven't figured out what yet. Well, Grace said, rising to her feet, perhaps defending our little ranch will give you time to consider it. She gathered their empty cups. We should all get some rest. Tomorrow may be a long day. As Grace disappeared into the house, Thomas lingered on the porch. She likes you, you know, he said bluntly. I haven't seen her smile so much since before Pa died. Nathan shifted uncomfortably. Your sister's just grateful for the help. It's more than that, Thomas insisted. And I'm glad for it. She deserves something good in her life after everything. Before Nathan could formulate a response, Thomas followed his sister inside, leaving Nathan alone with his thoughts and the vast Dakota night. The idea that Grace might see him as more than just hired help was both alarming and oddly warming. At 35, he'd long ago set aside thoughts of family or permanence. His life had been a series of temporary arrangements, moving on whenever the past threatened to catch up or the present became too comfortable. But there was something about Grace Campbell that made him wonder what it might be like to stop running. Her strength, her determination to protect what she loved, her capacity for kindness even in the face of loss, these qualities drew him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Such thoughts were dangerous luxuries, though. First, they had to survive what was coming, and that was far from certain. Dawn broke clear and cold, the air carrying the first hint of autumn's approach. Nathan was already up and moving, checking their preparations one final time. They had set up 3 defensive positions, one in the main house, one in the barn, and one in the small root cellar behind the kitchen garden. If things went badly at one position, they could fall back to the next. Grace had baked extra bread and prepared food that could be eaten cold, storing it in each location along with water and medical supplies. It was a level of forethought that impressed Nathan, though he hoped such precautions would prove unnecessary. By mid-morning, there was still no sign of Rawlins or his men. Nathan found Grace in the kitchen, methodically cleaning her father's old revolver. You know how to use that? He asked, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up, a strand of honey-colored hair falling across her forehead. Father made sure of it, said a woman alone on the frontier needed to be able to protect herself. She checked the cylinder with practiced movements. I've never shot a man, though. Let's hope you won't have to start today, Nathan replied. He hesitated, then added, if things go wrong, if it looks like we can't hold them off, I want you and Thomas to run. Head for the north pasture and into the hills. There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles up. We're not abandoning our home, Grace interrupted firmly. Or you, Grace, no. She set the revolver down and faced him squarely. My father died trying to protect this land. I won't dishonor his memory by running from it now. Nathan recognized the futility of arguing further. The same determination that had first drawn him to her would not allow her to flee, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Then let's make sure we don't have to run, he said instead. Where's Thomas? On the roof. He spotted dust to the south about 10 minutes ago. Nathan's muscles tensed. How many? He couldn't tell yet. They're still too far out. Moving quickly to the front of the house, Nathan climbed the ladder they'd positioned against the wall. Thomas lay flat on the sloped roof, his father's spyglass trained on the horizon. What do you see? Nathan asked, joining him. Thomas passed him the spyglass. 6 riders. Rawlins is with them this time. Nathan focused the glass on the approaching group. Sure enough, there were 6 men, and the one in the center, riding a handsome bay gelding, had the well-fed look of a businessman rather than a hired gun. Clement Rawlins, no doubt. They'll be here within the hour, Nathan estimated, collapsing the spyglass and returning it to Thomas. Get to your position. Remember what we discussed, no shooting unless I give the signal or they open fire first. Thomas nodded grimly, his young face set with determination. "I won't let you down. I know you won't," Nathan replied, surprised by how much he meant it. Descending the ladder, Nathan found Grace waiting at the bottom, her father's revolver holstered at her hip, incongruous against her simple blue dress. "They're coming," she said. It wasn't a question. "All 6 of them," Nathan confirmed, Rawlins included. Grace took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Then let's greet them properly." They positioned themselves on the porch, Nathan standing at the top of the steps, Grace slightly behind him, and Thomas in the upper window of the house with his rifle at the ready but out of sight. The waiting was always the hardest part, Nathan knew. The time when doubts crept in, when the mind conjured all the ways things could go wrong. The riders approached at a steady pace, not hurrying but not hesitating either. As they drew closer, Nathan could make out their features more clearly. Jenkins rode at Rawlins' right hand, his face set in its habitual sneer. Vega was on the left, his dark eyes scanning the property for signs of trouble. The others, Parker, Simmons, Walsh, and Burt, spread out in a loose formation behind them. Nathan adjusted his stance slightly, ensuring his right hand was free to draw if necessary. Beside him, he could sense Grace's tension, though she remained outwardly calm. The riders stopped about 20 yards from the house, just as Jenkins had before. This time, however, it was the well-dressed man in the center who spoke first. "You must be Wilder," Rawlins called. He was perhaps 50, with thinning hair and the ruddy complexion of someone who enjoyed his liquor. Despite the early hour, Nathan could smell whiskey on the air when he spoke. "My foreman tells me you've appointed yourself protector of the Campbell property." "Just helping friends," Nathan replied evenly. "Something I understand you know little about, Rawlins." The businessman's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Such hostility, and we've only just met." "I assure you, Mr. Wilder, I consider myself a friend to progress and prosperity things the entire territory will benefit from once my railroad comes through." "Seems to me your railroad could go around the Campbell land just as easily," Nathan observed. "Might cost you a bit more, but then, you don't strike me as a man who's hurting for money." Rawlins' smile tightened. "Direct routes are more economical. Surely a practical man such as yourself can appreciate that." "What I appreciate," Nathan replied, "is people who respect others' right to what's theirs. The Campbells aren't selling, not to you, not to anyone. That should be the end of it." "Unfortunately, it's not that simple," Rawlins sighed theatrically. "You see, I've already sold shares in this venture based on the current route. Changing it now would create complications, financial complications." "Your poor planning isn't the Campbells' problem," Nathan said coldly. Jenkins shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his gun. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Wilder. Mr. Rawlins is being generous, offering to buy what he could simply take." "Is that a threat, Jenkins?" Nathan asked, his voice dangerously soft. "It's a reality," Rawlins interjected smoothly. "Miss Campbell, surely you can see reason where these men cannot. Your father's stubbornness cost him his life. Must you and your brother pay the same price?" Grace stepped forward, her face pale but composed. "My father was murdered for defending what was rightfully his." "If you think that makes me more likely to sell to you, Mr. Rawlins, you understand very little about family loyalty." Rawlins' facade of civility began to crack. "This is your final chance. I'm prepared to offer $3,000 for the entire property, a more than fair price. Take it and leave Dakota Territory with your lives, or refuse and face the consequences." "I believe the lady has made her position clear," Nathan said, deliberately stepping between Grace and the mounted men. "Now, unless you have something new to offer, I suggest you ride on back to town." For a long moment, no one moved. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Nathan could practically see the calculations running through Rawlins' mind, weighing the cost of a direct confrontation against the potential for profit. Finally, Rawlins gave a curt nod. "Very well. You've made your choice." He turned his horse, but before riding away, he added, "Jenkins, show them what that choice means." The foreman grinned, an ugly expression that transformed his face into something barely human. With practiced speed, he drew his revolver and fired not at Nathan or Grace, but at the water barrel positioned beside the house. The wooden container splintered, water gushing onto the dry ground. "That's just the beginning," Jenkins called as the riders wheeled their mounts. "Next time, we won't be so considerate." Nathan held his position, though every instinct urged him to draw and fire. Beside him, Grace trembled with suppressed rage, but she too remained still until the riders had disappeared from view. "Why didn't you shoot?" Thomas demanded, emerging from the house with his rifle still clutched in white-knuckled hands. "We could have taken at least some of them." "And then what?" Nathan asked quietly. "The survivors would have returned with more men, and the law would have been on their side. Shooting first would have made us the aggressors. So we just let them destroy our property." Thomas's voice cracked with frustration. "No," Nathan replied, his expression hardening. "We let them think they've won this round, let them get comfortable, overconfident. And then we show them exactly what they're up against." Grace placed a calming hand on her brother's arm. "Mr. Wilder is right, Thomas. This isn't over, not by a long shot." As they set about repairing the damage to the water barrel, salvaging what they could, Nathan's mind was already racing ahead. Rawlins wouldn't wait long before making his next move, and it would be more destructive than this opening salvo. They needed to be prepared, but they also needed to take the initiative to strike before being struck. That night, after Grace and Thomas had gone to bed, Nathan slipped out of the house and made his way to the stable. His mare nickered softly as he entered, and he paused to stroke her velvet nose before saddling her. The moon was a thin crescent, providing just enough light to navigate by as he rode toward Fargo. It was time to learn more about Clement Rawlins and his operation. Knowledge in this kind of fight could be as valuable as ammunition. Fargo was quiet when Nathan arrived. Most businesses closed for the night except for the Silver Dollar Saloon, where light and the sounds of revelry spilled onto the darkened street. Nathan left his horse at the livery stable, paying the sleepy attendant extra to keep quiet about his presence, then made his way toward the saloon. Instead of entering through the front doors, he circled around to the back, finding a window where he could observe without being seen. Inside, Rawlins and his men occupied a large table in the corner, clearly celebrating what they perceived as their victory. Jenkins was regaling the others with an exaggerated account of their confrontation at the ranch, while Rawlins looked on with smug satisfaction. Nathan watched for nearly an hour, gathering what information he could from their conversation. It seemed Rawlins planned to return to the Campbell ranch the next evening, this time to set fire to the barn as a more pointed message. They would bring coal, oil, and torches, using the cover of darkness to approach from the east, where the terrain offered more concealment. Having learned what he needed, Nathan slipped away from the saloon and made his way toward the town's only hotel, a two-story building with peeling paint and sagging shutters. If his guess was correct, Rawlins would be staying there rather than making the ride back to wherever his actual residence was located. Sure enough, a quick conversation with a bored desk clerk, aided by a silver dollar, confirmed that Rawlins occupied room 6 on the upper floor with a view of the main street. Nathan considered his options. He could confront Rawlins now, perhaps force him to sign a document relinquishing his claim on the Campbell property. But such a document, obtained under duress, would never stand up to legal scrutiny, and it would likely only enrage Rawlins further, possibly pushing him to more extreme measures. No, a direct confrontation wasn't the answer, at least not yet. For now, information was enough. He would return to the ranch and prepare a welcome that Rawlins and his men wouldn't soon forget. Dawn was breaking as Nathan rode back into the Campbell ranch yard. Grace was already up, drawing water from the well, and her eyes widened in surprise as he dismounted. "Where have you been?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "Thomas checked your room when you didn't come down for breakfast." "I rode into Fargo," Nathan explained, taking the water bucket from her hands and carrying it toward the house. "Thought I'd see what Rawlins and his men were planning." Grace hurried to keep pace with his longer strides. "That was dangerous. If they'd spotted you, they didn't," he assured her. "But I learned something useful. They're planning to burn your barn tonight, thinking to approach from the east after dark." Her face paled. "The barn with the livestock inside." "I imagine that's the idea," Nathan said grimly. "Maximum damage, maximum terror." Inside the house, Thomas looked up from his breakfast as they entered, relief washing over his features at the sight of Nathan. "There you are. I was worried they might have—" "I'm fine," Nathan cut him off. "But we need to prepare. Rawlins and his men are coming back tonight." As they ate, Nathan outlined what he'd learned and his plan for dealing with the threat. It was risky, but if executed properly, it might be enough to make Rawlins reconsider the wisdom of his campaign against the Campbells. "You want to let them get close to the barn?" Thomas asked incredulously. "What if we can't stop them before they set it ablaze?" "We'll move the animals to the far pasture," Nathan explained, "and we'll be ready for them. They're expecting to find us sleeping in the house, unprepared. The surprise will be theirs." Grace chewed her lower lip thoughtfully. "It could work. But it means putting ourselves in danger." "We're already in danger," Nathan pointed out. "This way, at least, we choose the battlefield." Preparations consumed the rest of the day. They moved the livestock to safety, set up firing positions around the barn, and arranged lanterns that could be lit quickly to illuminate the yard. By sunset, everything was ready. "Remember," Nathan told Grace and Thomas as darkness fell, "no shooting unless absolutely necessary. I want to capture them, not kill them. Dead men tell no tales, but live ones can testify to attempted arson." They took their positions, Nathan concealed in the hayloft of the barn, Thomas behind a water trough 30 yards away, and Grace in the root cellar, which offered a clear line of sight to the eastern approach. Now there was nothing to do but wait. The hours passed slowly. A quarter moon rose, casting just enough light to see by without revealing their preparations. Around midnight, Nathan's patience was rewarded by the soft sound of horses approaching not from the road, but across the open land to the east, just as he'd anticipated. He peered through a gap in the barn wall, counting shadows as they materialized from the darkness. 6 riders, moving at a walk to minimize noise. They stopped at the edge of the property, and after a brief consultation, 4 dismounted while 2 remained with the horses. Nathan recognized Jenkins, Vega, Parker, and Simmons as they approached on foot, carrying what appeared to be cans of coal oil. They moved with the confidence of men who believed their targets were asleep and unaware, making little effort to conceal their presence now that they were close. When they were halfway to the barn, Nathan gave the signal 3 short whistles that sounded like a night bird. Immediately, Grace lit the lanterns they'd positioned around the yard, flooding the area with sudden, disorienting light. Jenkins and his men froze, momentarily blinded by the unexpected illumination. That moment of hesitation was all Nathan needed. He emerged from his hiding place in the hayloft, rifle aimed squarely at Jenkins. "Drop those cans and put your hands up," he ordered, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "You're trespassing on Campbell property with intent to commit arson." Instead of complying, Jenkins cursed and reached for his gun. Before he could draw, a shot rang out not from Nathan's rifle but from Thomas's position. The bullet kicked up dust at Jenkins' feet, stopping him mid-motion. "Next one goes through your knee," Thomas called, already chambering another round. Mr. Wilder said, "Hands up." For a tense moment, it seemed the men might choose to fight. Then Vega slowly raised his hands, followed reluctantly by Parker and Simmons. Only Jenkins remained defiant, his hand still hovering near his holstered revolver. 4 against 3 aren't bad odds," he sneered. "And 2 of yours are just a woman and a boy." "True," Nathan acknowledged, his aim never wavering, "but I've got the high ground and a clear shot at your head. Are you really willing to die for Rawlins Railroad?" Something in Nathan's tone must have convinced Jenkins of his sincerity, for after another moment of hesitation, he raised his hands as well. "This isn't over, Wilder." "Actually, I think it is," came Grace's voice as she emerged from her position, her father's revolver trained steadily on the men. "Because unlike you, we have witnesses." Nathan followed her gaze to where several riders were approaching from the direction of the main road. 3 men on horseback, led by an older gentleman with a silver star pinned to his vest. "Marshal Carter," Grace called in greeting. "Right on time." The marshal, a grizzled veteran with hard eyes that had seen too much of man's inhumanity, nodded curtly. "Miss Campbell, got your message. Seems it was timely." Nathan hadn't been privy to this part of the plan, and he shot Grace a questioning look as he climbed down from the hayloft, keeping his rifle trained on Jenkins and his men. "I sent Thomas into town yesterday afternoon," she explained with a small smile. "To telegraph the federal marshal in Bismarck, thought we might need an impartial witness to whatever happened." It was a smart move, one that Nathan wished he'd thought of himself. The territorial marshal would have jurisdiction that superseded the local sheriff's authority, meaning Rawlins couldn't simply buy his way out of this situation. Marshal Carter and his deputies quickly took control, disarming Jenkins and his companions and binding their hands behind their backs. When they searched the men, they found not only the coal oil but also several bundles of dynamite, far more than would be needed to burn a simple barn. "Looks like these boys were planning to do more than send a message," the marshal observed, examining the explosives. "This is enough to level the entire property." "Rawlins is still out there," Nathan warned, with Walsh and Burt. They were holding the horses at the edge of the property. The marshal nodded to one of his deputies. "Davis, take Johnson and check the perimeter. If they're still around, bring them in. If not, we'll deal with them later." As the deputies rode off into the darkness, Marshal Carter turned to Nathan. "And you are Nathan Wilder," he replied, lowering his rifle now that the immediate danger had passed. "I've been helping the Campbells protect their property." "He's the reason we're still alive," Grace added, moving to stand beside Nathan. "Rawlins' men killed our father 3 weeks ago. They would have done the same to us if Mr. Wilder hadn't arrived when he did." The marshal's expression darkened. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Campbell. Do you have proof?" "I do," Nathan said. "John Campbell's dying declaration, naming Jenkins as the man who shot him. I was there." It wasn't strictly true John hadn't specifically named Jenkins, only Rawlins' men. But Nathan had no doubt, based on everything he'd seen and heard, that Jenkins had been the trigger man. And a dying declaration carried significant weight in a territorial court. The marshal studied Nathan for a moment, as if measuring the truth of his words. Finally, he nodded. "We'll take statements from all of you in the morning. For now, these men are under arrest for attempted arson, trespassing, and conspiracy to commit murder. If what you say about Campbell's death is true, they'll hang for it." Dawn found the Campbell Ranch transformed into an impromptu legal office, with Marshal Carter taking detailed statements from Nathan, Grace, and Thomas. The prisoners had been secured in the barn overnight, under the watchful eyes of the deputies. The marshal's deputies didn't find Rawlins or the other 2 men, Grace informed Nathan as they took a moment alone on the porch. "They must have fled when they heard the commotion." Nathan nodded, unsurprised. "Rawlins doesn't strike me as the type to stand and fight when things go wrong. He'll either run for good or try to distance himself from what happened here." "Do you think it's over?" she asked, a hint of hope in her voice. "Not entirely," Nathan admitted. "Jenkins and the others will likely claim they were acting on their own, trying to protect Rawlins' interests without his knowledge, and Rawlins has money influence. But the marshal believes us," Grace pointed out, "and once word spreads about what happened here, others might come forward. Surely we can't be the only ones Rawlins has tried to bully." Nathan wished he shared her optimism. In his experience, men like Rawlins often escape justice through a combination of wealth, connections, and the willingness to sacrifice their underlings. But looking at Grace's face, alight with renewed hope, he couldn't bring himself to dampen her spirits. "We'll see it through," he promised instead, "whatever comes next." Later that morning, as Marshal Carter prepared to transport the prisoners to Bismarck for trial, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced new arrivals. Nathan, who had been helping repair damage to the fence line, straightened and reached for his rifle. "Riders coming," he called to the marshal. About a dozen by the look of it. Carter squinted into the distance, then relaxed slightly. That's Sheriff Wilson from Fargo. Recognize his bay gelding. Looks like he's brought a posse. Nathan's hand remained on his rifle. Question is, whose side is he on? The marshal's expression hardened. We'll soon find out, but regardless, these prisoners are in federal custody now. Wilson has no jurisdiction here. As the riders drew closer, Nathan could make out Sheriff Wilson in the lead, a stocky man with a bushy mustache and an air of self-importance. Beside him rode Clement Rawlins himself, his face set in lines of outrage. Behind them came a mixture of townspeople, and what appeared to be Rawlins' remaining men, Walsh and Burt among them. They reined in a respectful distance from where Marshal Carter stood, flanked by his deputies Nathan, Grace, and Thomas. "Marshal Carter," Sheriff Wilson called, his voice carrying a forced joviality. "What brings you to our territory?" "Federal business, Wilson," Carter replied coolly. "These men are under arrest for attempted arson, trespassing, and conspiracy to commit murder." "There must be some mistake," Rawlins interjected, his tone indignant. "These are my employees, simple cowboys who would never engage in such activities without my knowledge." "We caught them red-handed," Nathan said flatly, "with coal oil and enough dynamite to level this entire ranch." Rawlins affected an expression of shock. If that's true, they were clearly acting outside their authority. "I had instructed them merely to check on the Campbell property, as I've been concerned for the welfare of Miss Campbell and her brother since their father's tragic death." "That's a lie," Thomas burst out, his young face flushed with anger. "You've been threatening us for months." "You had our father killed." "Such wild accusations," Rawlins said smoothly, addressing his words to the marshal rather than Thomas. "The boy is understandably distraught after losing his father, but to suggest I had anything to do with John Campbell's death is absurd." "I am a businessman, not a murderer." Nathan stepped forward, placing himself between Rawlins and the Campbells. "John Campbell named your men as his killers before he died. I was there, I heard him." "And who exactly are you, mister?" Rawlins inquired, his eyes narrowing. "Wilder, Nathan Wilder." He met Rawlins' gaze steadily. "I was with John when your men ambushed us outside Bismarck. He took bullets meant for me." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Rawlins' face, quickly masked. "I know nothing of any ambush." "If my men were involved in such an incident, they were acting without my knowledge or consent." Marshal Carter, who had been observing the exchange with a lawman's practiced eye, finally spoke. "Mr. Rawlins, your men will stand trial in Bismarck. If they implicate you in Campbell's murder or in this attempted arson, you'll face charges as well. In the meantime, I suggest you keep your distance from the Campbell property." Rawlins bristled at the marshal's tone. "I have business interests that require—" "Your business interests don't supersede the law," Carter interrupted firmly. "Now, unless you and Sheriff Wilson have official business here, I suggest you return to town. We'll be leaving for Bismarck within the hour." For a moment, it seemed Rawlins might protest further. Then, with a tight nod, he turned his horse. "This isn't over, Marshal. I have friends in the territorial government who will be most interested to hear how you've interfered in local matters." "Threats against a federal marshal are ill-advised, Mr. Rawlins," Carter replied mildly. "Something to consider before you speak to these friends of yours." With a final glare that encompassed Nathan, the Campbells, and the marshal, Rawlins wheeled his mount and rode away. Most of his entourage followed, though Sheriff Wilson lingered. "You're making a mistake, Carter," the sheriff said quietly. "Rawlins owns half this county." "Then perhaps it's time the other half spoke up," the marshal replied. "Good day, Sheriff." As Wilson reluctantly followed Rawlins back toward town, Nathan felt some of the tension leave his body. The immediate danger had passed, though he harbored no illusions that their troubles with Rawlins were over. What happens now? Grace asked, watching the dust settle behind the departing riders. "Now," Marshal Carter said, "we take these men to Bismarck for trial, and I'll need all three of you to testify when the time comes." Thomas straightened, clearly pleased to be included as an equal. "We'll be there, Marshal." "It could be a month or more before the circuit judge arrives," Carter warned. Can you manage here until then? Grace's gaze met Nathan's briefly before she answered. We'll manage. Mr. Wilder has agreed to stay on and help us. It was news to Nathan, though not unwelcome. The thought of leaving Grace and Thomas to face Rawlins' inevitable retaliation alone was unacceptable. Still, he wondered when this decision had been made on his behalf. As if reading his thoughts, Grace added softly, "If that's still your intention, Mr. Wilder." There was a vulnerability in her question that touched something deep within him. "It is," he confirmed, surprised by the certainty he felt, "for as long as you need me." The look of relief and something warmer that crossed her face made the promise worth any risk it might entail. By mid-afternoon, Marshal Carter and his deputies had departed with their prisoners, leaving the Campbell ranch quiet once more. Nathan found himself standing with Grace near the corral, watching as Thomas exercised one of the horses. "Thank you," Grace said suddenly. "Not just for staying, but for everything. We would have lost the ranch or worse if you hadn't come when you did." "I made a promise to your father," Nathan replied, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I'm just keeping my word." "Is that the only reason you're staying?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Nathan looked at her, then really looked at her. The golden highlights in her honey-colored hair caught the afternoon sun, and her green eyes held a question he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. "No," he admitted finally, "it's not the only reason." A small smile curved her lips. "Good, because I've grown rather accustomed to having you around, Mr. Wilder." "Nathan," he corrected gently. "If we're going to be facing Rawlins together, you might as well use my given name." "Nathan," she repeated, as if testing the feel of it on her tongue. "And you must call me Grace. Miss Campbell makes me feel like a schoolteacher." The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm of work and watchfulness. True to Nathan's prediction, Rawlins made no further direct moves against the ranch, but his influence was felt nonetheless. Suppliers in town suddenly found themselves unable to sell to the Campbells. The local bank called in a small loan that John Campbell had taken out for improvements to the property. Even the mail rider seemed reluctant to stop at their gate. Through it all, Grace maintained a quiet dignity that impressed Nathan more with each passing day. She never complained, never showed fear, even when it became clear that Rawlins was trying to isolate them completely. Nathan found ways to circumvent the unofficial embargo. He rode to neighboring ranches, establishing trade relationships independent of Fargo's merchants. He helped Grace and Thomas expand their vegetable garden to reduce their reliance on purchased goods. And when necessary, he made the 2-day journey to Bismarck for supplies that couldn't be obtained closer to home. It was during one such return trip, about a month after the confrontation with Rawlins' men, that Nathan first admitted to himself the truth of his feelings for Grace. He'd been pushing the thought away for weeks, telling himself that his concern for her was simply part of the promise he'd made to John. But as he crested the final hill and saw the Campbell ranch spread out below, with Grace hanging laundry in the yard, the surge of emotion that filled his chest could no longer be denied. He was in love with her. The realization should have terrified him. For years, he'd avoided attachments of any kind, believing himself unworthy of such connections after the things he'd done during and after the war. Yet as he watched Grace pause in her work to shield her eyes, looking toward him with a smile of welcome spreading across her face, fear was the furthest thing from his mind. What dominated instead was a fierce protectiveness, a desire to ensure that her smile never dimmed, that the life she was fighting so hard to preserve remained hers to enjoy. And perhaps most surprisingly, a hope that he might somehow be worthy of a place in that life. "You're back earlier than expected," Grace called as he rode into the yard. "Did you find everything we needed?" Nathan dismounted, leading his mare toward the stable. "Most of it." The general store in Bismarck was out of that fabric you wanted, but the owner said they'd have more on the next supply wagon. Grace fell into step beside him. "It's not important. Did you hear any news about the trial? The circuit judge is expected next week," Nathan replied. "Marshal Carter sent word for us to be in Bismarck by Tuesday," her expression sobered. "So soon, it's good news," Nathan assured her. The sooner the trial, the sooner this will be resolved, or the sooner Rawlins will be free to resume his campaign against us, she countered. You know as well as I do that men like him rarely face consequences for their actions. Nathan couldn't argue with her assessment. The frontier justice system was notoriously favorable to those with money and influence, and Rawlins had both in abundance. Whatever happens, he said instead, we'll face it together. The words slipped out before he could consider their implication, but once spoken, he found he didn't regret them. Grace's eyes widened slightly, a flush coloring her cheeks. Together, she repeated softly. I like the sound of that. Before Nathan could respond, before he could find the courage to express the deeper feelings behind his words, Thomas came running from the direction of the creek, excitement evident in his face. Nathan, you're back. Did you bring the cartridges for Pa's rifle? The moment between Nathan and Grace dissolved, but something had changed. A shift as subtle yet significant as the first whisper of spring after a long winter. They exchanged a glance that held both acknowledgement and promise before turning their attention to Thomas and the more immediate concerns of the day. The journey to Bismarck for the trial was uneventful, though tension mounted as they approached the territorial capital. Nathan had insisted they travel together, unwilling to risk Grace and Thomas making the journey alone when Rawlins and his remaining men were still at large. They arrived to find the small city bustling with activity. The circuit court's arrival was always an event, drawing people from across the territory who had legal matters to resolve. Among the crowd, Nathan spotted several familiar faces from Fargo, including Sheriff Wilson, who pointedly looked away when their eyes met. Marshal Carter met them at the hotel where rooms had been arranged for witnesses in the case. The trial begins tomorrow morning, he informed them. Jenkins and the others are claiming they acted on their own without Rawlins' knowledge or approval. That's a lie, Thomas said heatedly. Everyone knows they work for Rawlins. Knowing something and proving it in court are different matters, the marshal replied with a grimace. But we have your testimonies and the evidence of the coal, oil, and dynamite. That should be enough to convict them of the attempted arson, at least. And my father's murder, Grace asked quietly. Carter's expression softened. That will be harder to prove. Without witnesses beyond Mr. Wilder and with the accused claiming self-defense, it may come down to the judge's assessment of credibility. Nathan saw the disappointment on Grace's face and wished he could offer more reassurance. The truth was, frontier justice was often incomplete at best. Even if Jenkins and his men were convicted of the attempted arson, they might escape the murder charge and Rawlins himself would likely remain untouched. Is Rawlins in town? He asked the marshal. Arrived yesterday, Carter confirmed. With a lawyer from St. Paul, expensive suit, fancy words. Been making the rounds, talking to anyone who will listen about how his loyal employees were set up by vindictive homesteaders. And people believe him? Grace asked incredulously. Some do, some don't, the marshal shrugged. That's why we have trials. Speaking of which, you should all get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day. After Carter left, Grace lingered in the hotel lobby while Thomas went upstairs to their rooms. Nathan, sensing her unease, remained at her side. What's troubling you? He asked gently. She looked around the crowded space before answering in a low voice. I saw Rawlins when we arrived. He was watching us from across the street, the look in his eyes. She shivered. It wasn't the anger I expected. He seemed satisfied somehow, as if he knows something we don't. Nathan's instincts, honed by years of survival in hostile environments, immediately sharpened. Stay here, he instructed, moving toward the hotel entrance. Outside, the street was busy with evening traffic, merchants closing up shop, saloons beginning to fill, travelers seeking accommodation for the night. Nathan scanned the area, searching for Rawlins' distinctive figure, but saw no sign of him. What he did see, however, was a familiar face among the pedestrians. Walsh, one of Rawlins' men who had escaped arrest. The man was moving purposefully toward the jail where Jenkins and the others were being held. Making a split-second decision, Nathan followed, keeping a careful distance and using the crowd for cover. Walsh turned down a side street, then into an alley behind the jailhouse. Nathan waited a moment before following, drawing his revolver as he moved into the shadowed passage. At the end of the alley, Walsh was engaged in conversation with a deputy. Nathan didn't recognize a young man with a nervous manner who kept glancing over his shoulder as he accepted what appeared to be a folded document and a small pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. Nathan had seen enough. He stepped forward, revolver leveled at the pair. "That's far enough." Both men froze, the deputy's face draining of color. Walsh's hand moved toward his holster, but Nathan's warning was clear. "Don't try it." "This ain't what it looks like," Walsh began, a practiced innocence in his tone that fooled no one. "It looks like bribing an officer of the law," Nathan replied coldly. "I wonder what Marshal Carter would make of that." The deputy, clearly terrified, started to back away. Didn't he just wanted me to deliver a message to the prisoners? That's all." "A message and some silver," Nathan observed. "Hand it over, both of you." When they hesitated, he cocked his revolver, a sound that carried unmistakable intent in the confined space of the alley. The deputy quickly surrendered the pouch and document while Walsh slowly raised his hands. "Rawlins will hear about this," Walsh threatened. "You're making a big mistake." "Not my first," Nathan replied evenly. "Now walk, both of you. We're going to have a chat with Marshal Carter." The revelation of attempted bribery and tampering with witnesses added another dimension to the case against Jenkins and his companions. Marshal Carter was furious when Nathan brought Walsh and the deputy before him, particularly at the corruption within his own ranks. "I thought I could trust my men," he growled, after locking Walsh in a cell and dismissing the deputy with a promise of charges to follow. "Should have known Rawlins would try something like this." "What was in the note?" Nathan asked, nodding toward the folded paper Carter had confiscated. The marshal's expression darkened further. Instructions for Jenkins and the others. They were to testify that they acted entirely on their own, that Rawlins had explicitly ordered them not to harass the Campbells. In exchange, he'd ensure they received light sentences and financial compensation for their families while they served their time. "So he's covering his tracks," Nathan observed, "making sure none of this leads back to him." "That's the way of it," Carter agreed grimly. "And it might have worked, too, if you hadn't spotted Walsh." He studied Nathan thoughtfully. "You've got good instincts, Wilder. Ever consider a job in law enforcement?" Nathan shook his head. "I've spent too much time on the wrong side of the law to wear a badge now." "Past is past," Carter shrugged. "It's what a man does going forward that counts." When Nathan remained silent, the marshal added, "Well, think on it. Men with your skills are hard to find out here." When Nathan returned to the hotel, he found Grace waiting anxiously in the lobby, relief washing over her face at the sight of him. "Where did you go? I was worried." He explained what had happened with Walsh and the deputy, watching as her expression shifted from concern to anger and finally to a grim satisfaction. "So we have proof that Rawlins was involved," she said. "Surely that will make a difference in the trial." "It ties him to the attempted arson, at least indirectly," Nathan acknowledged. "Whether that's enough to convince the judge of his involvement in your father's death remains to be seen." Grace was silent for a moment, absorbing this. Then she asked quietly, "Did Marshal Carter really offer you a job?" "Something like that," Nathan confirmed, surprised she'd focused on that detail. "Not that I'm considering it." "Why not?" Her question seemed genuinely curious rather than challenging. "You'd make a good lawman." Nathan leaned against the lobby's wooden counter, choosing his words carefully. "I've done things, Grace, things I'm not proud of, the kind of things that don't belong on a man's record when he pins on a badge." "We've all done things we regret," she replied softly. "It's what we choose to do next that defines us." Her eyes held his, unwavering. "And from what I've seen, Nathan Wilder, you're a man who chooses to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous, especially then." Her faith in him was both touching and terrifying. She didn't know the details of his past, the blood on his hands, the choices that had led him to the life of a drifter. If she knew the whole truth, would she still look at him with such trust in her eyes? Before he could respond, Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs, calling down to them. Are you two planning to stand in the lobby all night? Because I'm starving and the hotel restaurant stops serving in an hour." The moment broken, Grace stepped away, a small smile touching her lips. "We're coming. Heaven forbid you miss a meal, Thomas." As they made their way to the dining room, Nathan found himself wondering what it would be like to have this simple conversations, shared meals, the easy companionship of people who cared for one another as a permanent part of his life. It was a dangerous thought, one that could lead to hopes best left unformed. Yet he couldn't quite bring himself to banish it. The courtroom was packed the following morning, with spectators lining the walls and crowding the doorway. News of the attempted bribery had spread through Bismarck overnight, adding another layer of intrigue to what was already the most sensational case the territorial court had seen in some time. Nathan sat beside Grace and Thomas in the front row, acutely aware of Rawlins' presence across the aisle. The businessman had indeed brought a lawyer from St. Paul, a slick-looking individual with gold spectacles and an air of condescension that set Nathan's teeth on edge. When Jenkins and the other prisoners were brought in, Nathan noticed the foreman's surprise at seeing Walsh among them. Clearly, Rawlins hadn't informed his men of the failed bribery attempt. Jenkins shot a questioning look toward his employer, but Rawlins studiously avoided his gaze. The proceedings began with the judge, a stern-faced man named Hollister with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency, establishing the charges. Attempted arson, conspiracy, trespassing, and in the case of Jenkins, the murder of John Campbell. Each of the accused pleaded not guilty, though Nathan detected hesitation in Viga's response. The Mexican was the most intelligent of the bunch, and he had to realize that the evidence against them was substantial. Perhaps he was reconsidering the wisdom of remaining loyal to Rawlins. The prosecution, led by a territorial attorney named Lewis, presented its case first. Marshal Carter testified about finding the men on Campbell property with coal, oil, and dynamite. Grace described the months of intimidation they had endured, and Thomas, his voice steady despite his youth, recounted the day Jenkins had brought news of their father's death, grinning like he'd just won a hand of poker. When Nathan's turn came, he spoke clearly and directly, describing how he had met John Campbell in Bismarck, their plans to gather men to defend the ranch, and the ambush that had resulted in Campbell's death. Mr. Campbell's last words, Nathan testified, were that Rawlins' men had found them. He specifically asked me to protect his children and their property. "And did Mr. Campbell identify his attackers?" Lewis asked. "He said it was Rawlins' men," Nathan replied. "I didn't see the shooters myself. I was wounded in the initial volley. But based on everything that has happened since, I believe Jenkins was among them." Jenkins' lawyer objected to this speculation, and the judge sustained the objection, instructing the jury to disregard Nathan's belief. It was a minor setback, but Nathan had expected as much. Without direct identification of Jenkins as the shooter, the murder charge would be difficult to prove. The real surprise came during cross-examination, when Rawlins' lawyer attempted to discredit Nathan's testimony by bringing up his past. "Mr. Wilder," the attorney began, his tone deceptively casual, "would you tell the court about your activities during the years 1873 to 1875? Nathan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. There was only one reason for this line of questioning. Rawlins had investigated his background. "I worked various jobs," he replied cautiously. "Scout for the Army, some freight hauling, odd jobs here and there." "Isn't it true," the lawyer pressed, "that in October of 1874 you were wanted for questioning in connection with the deaths of 3 men in a saloon in Cheyenne?" A murmur ran through the courtroom. Beside him, Nathan felt Grace stiffen, though she didn't pull away from him as he might have expected. "Those charges were dropped," Nathan said evenly. "It was self-defense. The men had been hired to kill me over a dispute with their employer." "So you claim," the lawyer replied smoothly. "But isn't it also true that you've used different names in different territories? That you've been involved in numerous violent incidents over the past decade?" "Objection," Lewis interrupted. "The witness's past is not relevant to the events in question." I'm establishing the witness's credibility, Rawlins' lawyer argued. The jury should know who they're being asked to believe. Judge Hollister considered for a moment, then overruled the objection. The witness will answer the question, but counsel will confine his inquiries to matters that directly bear on credibility. Nathan met the lawyer's gaze steadily. I've defended myself when necessary. I've never harmed anyone who didn't try to harm me first. As for different names, I used my mother's maiden name for a time after the war. Many veterans did the same, trying to leave the past behind. The lawyer's smug expression suggested he'd gotten what he wanted doubt planted in the minds of the jury about Nathan's character. As he returned to his seat, Nathan risked a glance at Grace. Her face was composed, but her eyes held questions that he feared to answer. The defense presented its case next, with Jenkins and the others claiming they had gone to the Campbell ranch at night only because they feared a hostile reception during daylight hours. They insisted the coal oil was for their lanterns, and the dynamite was standard equipment for clearing obstacles when surveying for the railroad. It was a flimsy explanation, one that fell apart entirely when Walsh was called to testify. In exchange for leniency, he revealed the full extent of Rawlins' campaign against the Campbells, including direct orders to intimidate them by any means necessary. Mr. Rawlins said he needed that land, and he didn't care how he got it, Walsh testified, avoiding his employer's furious gaze. He told Jenkins to make an example of Old Man Campbell to show what happens to people who stand in the way of progress. The courtroom erupted at this revelation, forcing Judge Hollister to bang his gavel repeatedly for order. When quiet was restored, the judge instructed the bailiff to take Rawlins into custody pending further investigation. The sight of the businessman being led away in handcuffs brought a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief to Nathan. He had expected the legal system to fail, as it so often did when confronted with wealth and influence. That justice might actually prevail seemed almost too much to hope for. The trial concluded late that afternoon, with the jury retiring to consider its verdict. Nathan, Grace, and Thomas returned to their hotel, the events of the day hanging heavy between them. "Were you ever going to tell me?" Grace asked quietly once Thomas had gone to his room. They stood in the hotel corridor, the lamplit hallway empty save for themselves. Nathan met her gaze directly, unwilling to compound past omissions with present cowardice. "I don't know," he admitted. "I wanted to, but I was afraid of what you'd think of me." "I think," she said slowly, "that you are a man who has faced difficult choices and survived them. I think you've been running for so long that you've forgotten there's another way to live." Her voice softened. "And I think you've been alone for far too long, Nathan Wilder." Something in her eyes, acceptance, understanding, perhaps even something deeper, loosened a knot within him that had been tight for years. "I've done things, Grace, things a decent woman like you shouldn't have to hear about. And yet here I am," she replied simply, still listening. In the quiet of that hallway, with the distant sounds of the hotel's evening activity a muted backdrop, Nathan found himself telling her everything the war that had left him hollow, the years of drifting, the men he'd killed in self-defense, and the one death that still haunted him. A young man barely older than Thomas who had drawn on him in a Kansas saloon, too drunk to know better, dead before he fully cleared his holster. Through it all, Grace listened without judgment, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finally fell silent, emotionally exhausted from the unburdening, she reached out and took his hand in hers. "Thank you," she said quietly. Confused, he asked, "For what?" "For trusting me with your truth," she replied. "For believing I might understand instead of condemn." "Do you?" he asked, hardly daring to hope. "Understand?" "I understand that the man standing before me is the same one who has risked his life repeatedly to protect me and my brother," she said firmly. "The same one who kept his promise to a dying man, who faces danger without flinching but treats me with unfailing respect." Her fingers tightened around his. "The past has shaped you, Nathan, but it doesn't define you, not unless you let it." The verdict came the following morning, guilty on all counts for Jenkins and his men. The judge sentenced Jenkins to hang for the murder of John Campbell, while the others received lengthy prison terms for their roles in the attempted arson and conspiracy. Rawlins himself was held over for a separate trial, based on Walsh's testimony and the evidence of the bribery attempt. Marshal Carter informed them that additional charges might be forthcoming as other victims of Rawlins' tactics came forward, emboldened by the verdict. "It seems your stand against him has inspired others," the marshal told them as they prepared to leave Bismarck. 3 other ranchers have filed complaints about similar strong-arm tactics. Rawlins' empire is crumbling. "Will you need us to testify at his trial as well?" Grace asked. "Most likely," Carter confirmed, "but that won't be for a few months yet. The territorial prosecutor wants to build the strongest possible case. In the meantime, I expect Rawlins will be too busy trying to save himself to bother with your ranch." The journey back to Fargo was lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from all their shoulders. Thomas chatted animatedly about plans for the ranch now that the threat of Rawlins had been removed, while Grace rode beside Nathan in a comfortable silence that occasionally gave way to conversations about the future, a future that, for the first time in years, Nathan found himself eager to contemplate. On the final evening of their journey, as they camped under the stars about a day's ride from Fargo, Thomas fell asleep early, leaving Nathan and Grace sitting beside the fire. The light of the flames cast a warm glow over her features as she gazed into the dancing flames. "What will you do now?" she asked suddenly, breaking the companionable silence. "Now that your promise to my father has been fulfilled," the question caught him off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. With Rawlins' men in prison and Rawlins himself facing trial, the immediate danger to the Campbells had passed. The obligation that had brought Nathan to their ranch was, in a sense, complete. "I hadn't really thought about it," he replied, though this wasn't entirely true. He had thought about it, had thought of little else during the quiet hours of their journey. But the conclusion he'd reached seemed too presumptuous to voice. Grace turned to face him, her expression earnest in the firelight. "I'd like you to stay, Nathan, not out of obligation or duty, but because—" She hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. "Because I've come to care for you, more than I probably should, given how little time we've known each other." Nathan's heart seemed to stop, then restarted gallop. "Grace, you don't have to answer now," she hurried on. "I know it's sudden, and perhaps unfair of me to place this on you when you've already done so much, but I couldn't let you leave without at least saying the words." She began to rise, as if to end the conversation, but Nathan caught her hand, gently drawing her back down beside him. "I was going to ask if I could stay," he admitted, his voice low and rough with emotion. "If there might be a place for me, not just at the ranch, but in your life." The hope that blossomed in her eyes was answer enough, but her words, when they came, filled a void within him he'd scarcely acknowledged existed. "There's always been a place for you, Nathan. From the moment you rode into our yard, tired and wounded but still determined to keep your word to a man you barely knew." He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and brushed a strand of honey-colored hair from her cheek. "I can't offer much, Grace. I don't have land or money or a respectable name. I don't need those things," she replied softly. "I have land, money comes and goes, and a name is only as respectable as the person who bears it." Her smile held a certainty that steadied him. "What I need is someone who understands the value of a promise. Someone who stands by those he cares for, no matter the odds." Nathan had faced death many times without flinching, yet now, confronted with the possibility of everything he'd never dared to want, he found himself trembling. "I'm not sure I deserve this chance," he confessed. "But if you're willing to give it to me, I swear I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of it." In answer, Grace leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a kiss as gentle as it was profound, sealing a promise that needed no further words. They returned to the Campbell ranch on a golden autumn afternoon, the land spread before them like a promise waiting to be kept. Word of Rawlins' arrest and the conviction of his men had preceded them to Fargo, where the townspeople's attitude had undergone a noticeable shift. Those who had once shunned the Campbells now offered greetings, even congratulations as they passed through. Seems folks are quick to change their tune when the wind shifts, Nathan observed as they left the town behind. People are afraid of men like Rawlins, Grace replied without rancor. I can't blame them entirely. You're more forgiving than I would be, Nathan said. She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. One of my many virtues, you'll discover the rest in time. The casual mention of a shared future sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. During the journey home, they had spoken at length about what that future might entail: his permanent residence at the ranch, a partnership in its operation, and when enough time had passed for propriety's sake, marriage. Thomas, who had initially seemed wary of Nathan's developing relationship with his sister, had gradually come to accept and even welcome the prospect. At least I know you can handle yourself in a fight, the young man had conceded with grudging approval. And you make Grace smile. That's worth something. Now, as they approached the ranch, Nathan felt a sense of homecoming he hadn't experienced since before the war. This land, these people had become precious to him in ways he hadn't believed possible. The months that followed brought changes both large and small. With Rawlins' influence removed, the Campbell ranch flourished. The boycott that had strangled their business relationships in Fargo dissolved, and new opportunities emerged as the railroad, under new management following Rawlins' disgrace, negotiated a fair price for a small corner of their land, enough for a spur line but leaving the vast majority of the property intact. Nathan and Grace were married that winter in a small ceremony at the ranch house, with Thomas standing as best man and Marshall Carter making the journey from Bismarck to give the bride away. The marshal brought news that Rawlins had been convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy and attempted murder, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. Justice doesn't always prevail, Carter observed at the modest celebration following the ceremony, but when it does, it's worth acknowledging. Nathan, watching as Grace laughed at something Thomas had said, couldn't help but agree. I never expected any of this, he admitted to the marshal. When I made that promise to John Campbell, I thought I was just repaying a debt. Life has a way of surprising us, Carter replied with unexpected wisdom, especially when we stop running from it. After a pause, he added, my offer still stands, by the way. The territory could use a man with your skills. Nathan considered the proposal with more seriousness than he had before. The idea of wearing a badge, of using his abilities to protect rather than simply survive, held a certain appeal. And with Fargo growing rapidly, a deputy marshal base there would serve a genuine need. I'll think on it, he promised. After the spring calving, Carter nodded, satisfied. That's all I ask. Later that night, as Nathan and Grace stood on the porch of what was now their home, watching as the first snow of the season began to fall, he found himself reflecting on the strange path that had led him to this moment. From a rootless drifter to a man with land, responsibility, and most precious of all, love. What are you thinking? Grace asked, leaning into his side as he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. I'm thinking, he replied, about the day I rode into Fargo, how close I came to just passing through. But you didn't, she reminded him. You kept your word, you stayed. And now I can't imagine being anywhere else, he admitted, turning to face her fully. In the soft light spilling from the windows, her eyes held the same warmth, the same acceptance that had first begun to heal the fractured parts of him. I love you, Grace Wilder. The name still sounded new to both of them, but right as if it had been waiting all along for them to discover it. And I love you, Nathan Wilder, she replied, rising on tiptoe to brush her lips against his. Welcome home. In the years that followed, Nathan often thought back to that moment when he had stood alone against Rawlins' 6 men, declaring his intention to defend the Campbell siblings and their land. At the time, it had seemed a desperate stand with little hope of success. Now, as he watched their family grow, first with the birth of their son, John, named for the man whose final act of courage had set these events in motion, and later their daughter, Elizabeth, he recognized it for what it truly was. The moment he had stopped merely surviving and begun, at last, to live. The Dakota Territory changed around them, eventually becoming part of the state of North Dakota in 1889. Fargo grew from a frontier settlement into a proper city, with brick buildings replacing wooden structures and the sound of train whistles marking the passage of time as regularly as church bells. Through it all, the ranch remained a constant, passed down through generations of Wilders who knew the story of how their legacy began with a dying man's request, a promise kept, and a lone cowboy who found the courage to stand against impossible odds for something more valuable than his own life: the chance to love and be loved in return.